So the title of today's meeting is How Powerful is the Media? Our speaker today is Jan Nielsen. She's a teacher in South London and a long-standing member of the Socialist Workers Party in Brixton branch as well. I won't take the floor anymore, I'll just pass it over to Jan.
Okay, comrades. Well, it's a very important question, isn't it? How powerful is the media? Because if we want to build a genuinely democratic society in which the voices of everyone are heard, obviously the type of press we have is very important in that. And indeed, I'd just say, I will talk about the referendum. I'm sure we'll all mention it in every meeting that takes place in Marxism this week. But I think to some extent, the lack of democracy and the lack of the prejudices, if you like, of the free press were really shown in the fact that everybody woke up last Friday morning somewhat surprised that the Leave vote had won. And basically, because we'd had weeks of, hadn't we, a tsunami of publicity and press coverage which encouraged people to vote Remain, and yet the voices of hundreds and thousands of the poorest people who aren't part of the kind of London bubble, suddenly it hadn't featured in the press and suddenly expressed itself in a way that lots of people found quite surprising. Now, to say, I'm going to say also, the question about the press is not really, the answer to the question is not just a black and white question. If it was the case that the press was all powerful, then to be honest, we might as well all pack up our bags and go home, because what's the point in trying to change the world if the press barons have got ideological control over everything that we think? If it was a no, that the press has no power, then why on earth would politicians or even celebrities or anyone who wants to influence society, why would they spend so much time? Just think about Blair, just think about the politicians. They're groomed and coaxed to be media friendly. Again, indeed, so much of the argument I think that's going on at the moment about whether or not Corbyn is electable is actually going to be focused, and I've had the argument in my school, it's focused on, does he dress properly, does he have a dynamic enough delivery. I like what he says, Jan, I agree with you, he's incredibly sincere, everyone thinks he's a really nice guy, but he just can't hack it in the television studios and on question time. So, actually, they wouldn't be doing that if the press wasn't important. I want to make the point, actually start by making the point, that the press, the media, and particularly newspapers and television, is still the main way, and although we all may be on our Facebooks and our platforms in social media, the vast majority of people in Britain still get most of the information that they have about society from the newspapers and from the television. Again, although newspaper coverage, newspaper sales, print sales, may be on a decline, the web and the newspaper websites seem to be replacing that. And it is still the case, and I think we need to remind ourselves in this discussion, despite what we may think, that The Sun is still the most widely read newspaper in Britain, has a readership of over 13 million, compared to probably the newspaper that would be our newspaper of choice, which is The Guardian, and that has a readership, that Guardian and Observer combined have something like a readership of 5 million. So newspapers still sell enormous numbers, and enormous numbers of people read what the newspapers say. In Britain, on average, people watch 4 hours of television. It's constantly, with each year, increasing, and in America, on average, people watch 8 hours a week. You combine that with the fact that really there is nowhere you can go in which the advertisements, the media, impinges on every bus stop, on every bus that comes past. The images and the products that are being sold to us that it bombards us in every aspect of our daily lives. It's very difficult. I mean, even when you are on social media, you're constantly being fed a source of adverts on everything from, you know, lingerie to food. But I suppose the key point is, how does all of that then, if the media impinges on every aspect of our lives and is around us every day, how does it shape what we think? Now, obviously, I think this comes in lots of different ways, some of them quite overt and some of them more subtle or covert. I mean, the first thing is that obviously all the newspapers, when it comes to big things like the general elections, most of the newspapers have a political stance. They don't attempt to be neutral about how the general public should vote. And amongst all the plethora of newspapers that exist, only one newspaper, the Daily Mirror, has consistently been a newspaper, by and large, that has supported the Labour Party in a general election. All other newspapers, to one extent or another, by and large, have supported the Tories, or at some points the Guardian and the Independent, the Liberal Democrats. So there's an overt trying to influence the way who it is that we elect into Parliament. But actually, the covert, you know, the more subtle assumptions that the media accepts, I think is much more pernicious. And the kind of things I'm talking about is there is no newspaper other than, you know, socialist newspaper like Socialist Worker, which actually there's none of them that reject the inequalities, the stratification, the class structure of society. Without exception, they assume that there is a rich and there is a poor. They assume that, you know, profits and losses, I mean, the way that the economy generally is talked about in the media, talks about it almost as if it was a force of nature. It's very rarely, you know, the odd columnist in some of the more quality newspapers might try and analyse, but by and large there is an assumption that profits for capital are good, and actually, and often that people have to pay with their own jobs, or they have to pay with cuts in their salaries if the economy isn't functioning, it's so-called effectively. And there's no questioning about what does economic effectiveness mean, or in whose benefit it is. It's also an assumption that we live in a democracy. I mean, there's been a lot talked about that again over the last couple of weeks. You know, the great parliamentary democracy that is the British Constitution. The idea that actually we only vote once every 5 years, that we do it in private, that it should be a secret by and large activity, is something that none of the press ever really seem to challenge. For us, obviously, if you want a real democracy, we would like to see certainly people voting on all the important aspects of their lives, not just about who should govern us once every 5 years, but it's assumed that this is the mother of parliaments and this is the kind of best way that you can do it. It's assumed within the press that anyone who goes against, well, it's assumed that the status quo is the best that we can have, the present status quo, and there is an assumption in all of the newspapers that anyone who goes against that, whether it's strikers, whether it's protesters and demonstrators, whether it's people who are engaged in so-called anti-social activity, whoever defines what that is, there is some kind of assumption that these people are bad and destructive. You only have to think about it or reflect on it in the way that they use the language whenever there is a strike. Even when it's the doctors, even when, you know, it's a strike that has massive public support. The language that is used, that they choose to use about, angry protesters, about, the disruption that strikes cause, You know, they always use derogatory, negative language to describe those activities, and they're very rarely, I mean, you know, they do, you know, the BBC often does, to try and assume some level of balance, but it's very rare that the discussion about those kind of things is led by the people who are involved in the protest or the demonstrations or the strikes. They might get a 2-minute soundbite, but by and large, it will be important people who are interviewed and quoted. And the important people are assumed to be the politicians, the news pundits, the people who live around the Westminster bubble. So that's incredibly important, you know, the subtle nature of those kind of assumptions that protect essentially the status quo. And of course also, in another way that it kind of shapes the way we think, or that it tries to shape the way we think, is really what it leaves out of the information that it provides us. And I think the most startling, I mean, we've all been, haven't we, on a demonstration where we've looked around us and we've said, the press can't possibly ignore this protest. You know, there's 100,000 of us on the streets, it's bound to be. You go home, you watch the 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock news, and there's nothing around it. I mean, I'm just arguing at the moment for a strike next Tuesday of teachers, and it's one of the key questions that some of the teachers who are a bit more reluctant about striking have asked. But it won't get on the press. We never get the press. Nobody hears what we've got to say. The fact that those protests are often kind of blacked out or ignored is something that also, you know, it's somebody else making a decision about what's newsworthy. And I think the most blatant example of that, certainly at the moment, is actually the activities, the near revolution that has been taking place in France. I mean, I don't actually, I have to admit, necessarily get a daily newspaper anymore because I walk to work, but I listen to the radio on the way to work. And you would have to, you know, I would be 100 before I think I'd hear them doing a serious report about the protests, the near revolution that's taken place in France that has totally disrupted the workings of that country. But the British press have chosen that they won't actually cover that. And, you know, you could go on, the things about the National Gallery strike that was so important to fighting off privatisation. I mean, even if you think I was surprised and ran to watch Newsnight last night when I heard it was actually having a discussion, a serious item on the programme about the crisis in housing that exists in London, because actually it's something I experienced through school and teaching, because we talk about the disappeared, the children who were in our classes one day who suddenly had been evicted from home and moved out to some godforsaken place, I don't know where, nobody knows where they've gone. But actually the first time last night that I heard a serious item about the effect of housing in London. And of course also, I mean, one of the key criticisms that lots of people will make about the media in general and the press is that there is such an enormous amount of trivia. No doubt, I mean, people kind of laugh often, don't they, at people who read, you know, the red top newspapers, because, you know, after you've got past the first page, to be honest, it is actually, isn't it, a diet of absolute trivia. You know, it's completely obsessed with the lives of celebrities, because I think generally it tries to kind of sell a general idea that, you know, whether you're Susan Boyle, that shows my age, or Ronaldo, you know, that people can in some, or one of the Kardashians, I suppose, that you can come from nothing to somebody who's important and envied and obviously very wealthy if you kind of try and do something famous. It perpetuates really the idea that individuals can, through, there's no structural barriers, and can, through some effort of their own, find themselves rich and famous. And of course, also, you know, not just that it's obsessed with celebrities, but it's also obsessed with the royal family. And I thought it was actually quite interesting, and people might want to discuss this. Why? You know, we just had the birthday, the 90th birthday, I think we're still having it actually, of the Queen. And I'll be honest, you know, in any of the quality newspapers, or on the BBC or Radio 4, which is what I listen to, I did not hear one Republican interviewed to talk about why a whole tranche of people, and most of the people I work with believe this, that the royal family are parasites on the face of humanity. But that was something that wasn't in any way raised. You know, in every school there were Union Jack flags and some kind of bake-off. It's always bake-off now in every school. We're bake-off bonkers in schools at the moment. You know, bake-off for the Queen's, you know, birthday, when the royal family tour, wherever it was they went recently. You know, I mean, I don't even read this stuff. I think I don't read this stuff. But I actually probably could describe every outfit that Kate, whatever her name is, actually wore. Yeah? I mean, you know, because even if you don't want to see it and you think it's a pile of crap, actually, it's rammed down your throat, and the diet is so enormous that you find yourself knowing things about the royal family which I really have got absolutely no interest. But of course, it does, doesn't it? You know, the fact that the newspapers, and we ask why do they do this, it does, to a large extent, reflect the alienation of lots of people's lives, and the press feed it. Because, you know, I will say, you know, I'm not a big television watcher in general, that is absolutely true, but, you know, at the end of a very hard day at work, when I'm exhausted, I don't tend to come home, I have to admit, and read Rosa Luxemburg. I will tend to flop on the sofa like millions of other thinking people do, and watch something, you know, download something that's, you know, not too taxing on my intellect, because that's what the world of alienated labour often forces us, really, or gives us no other option to do but to dwell, or wallow, I should say, in the trivia that we find we're presented with. Now, I want to then say that this is not about a conspiracy. It isn't that the press actually, you know, press barons and the key journalists or the proprietors of the major newspapers get together and conspire to feed us this diet. It's actually based on the fact, and we would argue as Marxists, as socialists, that the media formed part of the superstructure of society, the ideological superstructure of society, along with things like the church, religion, and education. Yeah, and it serves the interests of the capitalist system. And Karl Marx said that the class that has the central means of production at its disposal has control over the means of mental production, i.e., dominant ideas. And that, why does that happen? Because of actually a tiny minority of people in our society own and control the worldwide media, and the number of people owning and controlling it is actually getting smaller and smaller as capitalism develops. In order to own and control a media outlet, you do have to be virtually, or you can certainly make yourself to some extent, a billionaire. And even since the Levinson inquiry in 2011, you know, which was sparked by the hacking scandals that took place, actually the media is controlled is controlled in very few hands. I mean, 70% of UK newspapers are owned by three major companies. Murdoch's News UK owns a third of that. Although I'm interested to see that 55% of radio listeners in Britain listen to BBC channels. Actually, the news content of almost all commercial channels, well, 43%, is controlled by Sky, the biggest news corporation. It shares, 43% of the audience listening to commercial news. I think also what is interesting for me, and I'm old enough to remember, when there were lots of local newspapers. Now, a quarter of local government areas have no local newspaper at all. And 35% of the areas that do have only one newspaper. Since March 2011, 141 local newspapers have closed down. And this goes along with changes in local authority structure. I mean, certainly, if you want your local council to be accountable for what it's doing in terms of education, whether it's academisation of schools, whether it's, like in Brixton, completely redeveloping the centre of town to offer, luxury apartments and developments for multinational companies, actually, we used to have local newspapers which featured all of these things that were taking place and informed local democracy. It's I think it's no accident that local newspapers have closed down at exactly the time when the structure of local authorities was changed by under the Blair government, and we moved from what were the old committees to these new, remote ivory towered cabinets in local areas. But, all of that sounds pretty grim, but that is not the full story, because people are not empty vessels that, media moguls can just pour information into our heads. We live the media through our own learned experience, which is actually why it was interesting during the referendum that you could have something like Murdoch's News Corporation actually have one newspaper, The Times, that argued people should remain, and another newspaper, The Sun, that argued that people should leave, because they recognised that the experience of their working class readers outside of the Westminster bubble and the affluent South was very different from those people who live in the affluent South. It's also, I think, important to realise that although, as I said, the vast majority of newspapers since the Second World War in Britain have campaigned for Tory election victories, we've actually had 12 Labour victories since the election. So people don't do necessarily as they're told by big media. And of course, one of the other really important examples was really, the Blair government, when in the run-up to the Iraq War. I mean, by and large, again, I can't quite remember all the positions that the newspapers took. I think the Mirror did take a reserve position on the war, and the Guardian was all bloody over the place over it, to be honest. I think it came down in favour of the war. But actually, we had millions of people on the streets protesting about the Iraq War. People didn't believe there were weapons of mass destruction, as Tony Blair tried to tell us. And the fact they went to war was not that they persuaded us that it was the right thing. Actually, they went to war because they could do it, not because the general public was behind them. And indeed, I think the ruling class have spent the 10 years, 12, 13 years since trying to persuade people about the dangers of Islam in the Middle East, as a result of the fact that, we didn't support it then. And of course, there are all sorts of times when people's anger at some of the, appalling hypocrisy that goes on comes to the fore and spills over, and the press has to reflect it. So we saw that over the question of the MP's expenses. you know, actually they couldn't cover it up because the outrage amongst people when they saw what was happening was so huge that the press had to go for the MPs. The same happened over the question of phone hacking, as we saw. They had to go and try and make the media moguls accountable because they couldn't hold, if you like, all of us down once we had some of that information given to us. But I now want to just switch a bit to talk about social media. I'm not because I'm in any way an expert. I suspect that 99% of you in the room knows more about this and probably does more on social media than I do. I'm a product of my age, I'm afraid. But it is really the biggest change that's happened in the way that we gather or get information. So I think we need to talk about it for a few minutes. I mean, there's a prediction that by 2019, almost 3 billion people across the world will be social media users. But actually, there's a profound inequality in our access to social media. So it's the case that Japan, 91% of people have access to the internet. Obviously, you've got to have access to the internet to be on social media. In Britain, 78%. And although India is the fastest growing, it's still only 35%. But in Iraq, it's 13%. In most of the African countries, it's below 5%. I mean, you know, statistics as low as 1.2. So I think the importance about access to social media is what do we say about how it affects the balance of class forces? Because there's been quite a lot of discussion about this, particularly following the student events, the student protests of 2011, and the Arab Spring. And there's some people, Paul Mason was one of them, and so was Laurie Penny at the time. I mean, you don't hear much of her now, but certainly these people argued that, that basically you could organise a revolution or an uprising through a Twitter storm, essentially, you know, as if 164 characters could get you to risk life and limb, but apparently they thought you could. And they argued that really this was an alternative to the need for political organisation. I mean, you know, Laurie Penny talked about, and it seems to be the case superficially, that anyone can blog. It's, it's a horizontal, it's an inclusive platform. So lots of inclusive platforms where, you know, your age, your status, your class, your gender doesn't make any difference. You can have your say. Now, I want to really say about this firstly. I think it is the case that you can, in a way, create your alternative universe on, I do it on my Facebook. I Facebook in the morning. It is the first thing I go on to, actually. And I do. Why? Because Alex Kalinikos, sometimes Kevin Ovington, sometimes Nick Grant, I can see some people in this room, Joseph, yeah? They've read the articles, they've chosen the articles. I don't even need to think about it, do I? I can share those articles. It makes you look very intelligent. Some of it, you know, isn't that wonderful article from the FT? Yeah, you can, and I'm sure if you looked at all of the things I share, you would see that it would reflect my socialist, politics. But actually, if we can use it to create a world where everybody's going to those protest events, the right can use it as well. I've never been on the EDL Facebook, I've never been on Jobbik's Facebook, but actually I'm sure that fascists right across Europe have used social media to organise for protests, to get people to protest. Of course, it can help to mobilise. I mean, it was interesting on Monday, wasn't it? If anyone was outside, it was in Parliament Square, that within 24 hours' notice, what the police claimed were 10,000 people gathered in Parliament Square to demonstrate their support of Corbyn. But actually, you had to be in the square. It wasn't enough just to like it on Facebook. Actually, the whole point about the mobilisations that take place on social media is they are to get you into the places where we can be together in order to create a powerful mass and in order to be able to agitate and make ourselves feel powerful and united. And this was exactly what happened really over the student protests in 2011, that actually the best student unions, where the best activists were, particularly universities like Sussex, where there had been occupations, those were the student unions from UCL, from Edinburgh and Sussex, who put on the coaches that took people off the Facebook into an arena where we can feel the collective strength of people organising together. And of course, that was exactly the same in Tahrir Square. Very few people had access to social media in Egypt anyway, and actually the result of the Arab Spring was both the combination of what had happened in Tunisia in 2006, plus the fact that socialists on the ground at Egypt had worked around, particularly the Malala, the textile factories, to get workers out. And as I said rather flippantly earlier, you don't risk life and limb, and that's what it meant in Tahrir Square. You don't risk life and limb just because you've been convinced on Facebook. You've probably had a whole number of people who've talked to you, agitated with you prior to the event, and you go with other people in order, as I say, to make, to form a strong bloc. I would also say, it might be something for discussion because I'm running out of time, is also the extent to which the social media is a focus of surveillance. I mean, we see that certainly with the Snowden, events. The fact that the people in power we know that they can see what we're reading and see what we're doing via social networks, and of course the fact that if you pay a provider, the provider's making a profit. And actually, again, we've seen in China, I mean, they call it the Great Firewall of China, that there is plethoras of legislation in China to prevent social media sharing things that might destabilise the establishment. And there they have the highest number of cyber dissidents and journalists in prison in China for their activity on social media. And indeed in Egypt, Vodafone, which was the biggest provider of the social network, the government instructed Vodafone to disconnect the connections, and when to shut it down, and when it came back online, it came back with a pro-Mubarak message. But I just want to end then on this. We might want to discuss more about the social media, I hope. I'll learn things. But I then want to just add, I feel I have to really, to say why we have our own paper in the Socialist Workers Party. We have our own paper really, I think, for two main reasons. But the first reason is it is a tool of organisation. Yeah? And, just like our comrades in Egypt, who printed their own newspapers, flyers, etc., we use Socialist Worker to make connections between people that are fighting. How often have you picked up Socialist Worker and seen about a struggle that no other aspect of the media is covering? It's an attempt to win together and knit together all the struggles of people that are taking place against the system. It's also a place where we try and open up that democratic debate to give the voice to the most oppressed, those who are marginalised, those who have been fighting. So I hope you'll think it encourages a dialogue with the best people about how we fight. It helps the weak learn from the strong about how the system can be changed. And also, I think it helps us be identified as people. I can go to the protest on Monday night. I could just be there as anybody, just Jan the public. coming to join the protest, but I'm there. I want to say when I go to protest that I'm there as a revolutionary. I've got this set of ideas, and if you like what my paper says, then we can start a relationship. It can help to make the organisation grow. And I'll just end by saying, and really will end by saying, certainly in a revolutionary situation, the first thing that we would do, how we would do it, that's interesting, we would take over the printing presses, the bourgeois printing presses, and the radio stations. And it's no accident that in a counter-revolution, that's what the other side, our enemies, do as well.
Well, thank you very much for this presentation, and I think there's much there to think about, and I particularly welcome the idea that it's important to counter the conspiracy type thinking that media is all powerful, and it's even when it doesn't come from conspiracy theorists per se, this kind of thinking pervades a lot of what happens in conversation on the left, and it doesn't mean that people are lost to a more complex and more realistic kind of thinking. I think that one of the things which is important to bear in mind is that not only is the media all powerful, and we can counter it because we have the experience of people, and they can counter what they read, what they see on television, with what they live in their everyday lives. But the media is itself, and we can have alternative media, but the media itself, even capitalist media, is a terrain of struggle. And maybe we can have a few words as well about journalists' unions and things like that. I live in Paris. I was in the movement during the past 3 months. You haven't heard about it on the radio. And that's become a huge terrain of struggle, and also underlines a number of things about the new technologies, not just the social media, but the cameras, the smartphones that people have. So with all the police violence there's been on the demonstrations, every time much more than it used to be. Now we have documentary proof, we have videos, we have pictures, and they can find their ways to mainstream media, and when they don't, they go on websites anyway, and that's become a huge problem with the government, for the government. And it does mean that a lot of independent journalists and photographers have been stopped from actually going to demonstrations. That's one there's an awful lot of struggle at the moment for basic democratic rights in France, and one of them is freedom of the press, in the most basic terms.
Hi, I'm just over from the SWP in Ireland, and we're just after coming out of the water charges campaign over there. It was a huge movement. It's basically politicised thousands and thousands of people across Ireland, with thousands of people on the streets. But basically, when they brought around their water metering programme, overnight there was hundreds and hundreds of localised Facebook pages that were set up, like really local ones like Clondalkin, Meter Watch, all this kind of stuff. But it really you got a good sense of how social media was able to democratise it, because we could when we could see Irish Water to come in and do some metering in our area, we could put it up on Facebook, they're here, and within seconds you'd have ordinary working class people coming down, and we'd be blocking the meters, at 7 in the morning, and it was really exciting. But now we're moving. That's kind of won, and we've basically won that struggle. But now we're trying to move things into the workplace sphere, and that's a kind of a much harder task. When there was a huge kind of demonisation of water charges protesters during the campaign, but because it was such a personal issue and everyone was affected by it, they knew that this demonisation wasn't true. But when it's coming out into the workplace, the Lewis strikers, the media are finding it much easier to demonise them by going, a teacher is making this much, a Lewis striker's only doing this, he's only driving a truck or whatever, like why is he asking for more wages than you? And we actually have people that were in the water charges movement with us agreeing with the media on this. We're really trying to, try and fight back against that propaganda that the media is using against us. So I think we should take a leaf out of the CGT workers in France and actually, you know, go in and tell them to stop the presses and actually just print the left-wing papers. You know?
I had you first, and then.
Okay. Okay, first thanks. Oh, Daisy. Yeah, first thanks for the great introduction. And no, I just wanted to talk about internationalism and internet, because obviously the fact that the Social Worker newspaper, you can find it anywhere and it prints stories from all over the world, is brilliant. But also kind of being active and aware of how we can completely utilize the internet for internationalism. Like in the Arab Spring, people trying to open up the internet so that the news can be let out from the country so that we can kind of spread it out elsewhere is a very important thing. So it needs a lot of expertise and dedicated people to make that kind of movement possible. So it's not just using social media on a kind of everyday basis, but actually kind of getting into the world of internet and realizing that as a kind of means of production, even though it's a virtual one. But then also I think it's very important to realize how the kind of system within internet is already operating. For instance, Google, and as a search engine it is smart and keeps records of what you look and what you find. Like if I were to look up socialism on my Google, well, obviously the results would be very different from the fascist who searched it up. And that kind of smart coding and technology, I think, kind of divides people even more, because it's not like internet is a completely free and democratic space of information, but it is actually given to us in the same way that media selects things for us, even though it's based on our own experience and how we use it, but it kind of starts feeding it even more. So kind of waking up at some point and kind of looking to your life choices or worldview or whatever, it becomes harder because internet kind of pre-makes the choices for you. So I think education in kind of realizing that sort of things about internet as a democratic means of giving out information is very important.
There's a post on social media recently that showed, there's a writing from the Sun back in the 1980s when it was deeply homophobic and it's attacking the loony left councils for being, for promoting gay rights, it was called in those days, and also quite anti-Irish. And when I was out working in the cinema, I got a lot of homophobic abuse. There was no legal protections back in the early 90s. Like, hope you Darvati, you fag bastard, from one guy every single day. You got all that sort of abuse, and then after being out for 3 months and having to put up with it and having a breakdown and various other things, the management sacked me. And every single worker supported me against the management. Every single one, including the guy who said hope we Darvati to me every single day. So, and then after I got my job back, the abuse died down and people started saying we haven't had a pay rise for 2 years, we were on £2.75 an hour. They said, well, we're still paying our taxi fares home on weekdays when there's no buses. And we actually won those things straight away without even a fight. So it's actually, when you look at these ideas in the media, you see people today absorbing anti-migrant sentiments and so on. Actually, if we stand up and start fighting, it's when you do that concretely, you challenge those ideas that people absorb from the media without thinking uncritically. And it's, when you stand up and fight, then they actually have to say, whose side are we on? And I've seen people's ideas change as a result of me standing up and getting my job back. And I was the first person in that workplace to do so. We had no union. It was before I joined the SWP. I was apolitical. It's part of the reason I'm political in the SWP today.
I just wanted to kind of add some stuff to what Jan's already said, and mainly try and stress the economic workings of the media industries, because I think if we understand that, it's possible to understand some of what appear to be contradictions in, for example, the debate we're having about social media and the fact that, is it or not a tool for revolutionary organisation. I think we have to, and similarly, for example, the most subversive TV programme globally that there has ever been is produced by Rupert Murdoch. The Simpsons is by far the most radical piece of children's and adults' entertainment to have reached billions of people around the world. And how do you explain that, for example? How do you explain, as I think Jan hinted, the fact that the Sunday editions of the Telegraph and the Mail had different recommendations in the referendum to the weekly editions of those papers? And I think you have to think about the core day-to-day function when there isn't a referendum, when there isn't a terrorist atrocity, when there isn't a royal wedding, is for newspapers to actually sell our eyes, in the case of anything we read or see, or our ears, if it's radio programs, to advertisers. That is the way they get their money. That is the way those businesses survive and produce profits. And it's that relationship which can explain, for example, that Google and Facebook are mainly interested, as Jan suggested, in not what we say necessarily, what the actual content of our exchanges through those means. They're interested in the fact that millions of us are doing it, and Google and Facebook then own all of that stuff that we're communicating, and they can sell the fact that there are so many of us communicating to advertising companies, which is why those sidebar things keep coming up in Facebook and so on. And I think it's a matter of trying to balance our ideological analysis of what the media does with a clear understanding of this economic function. As industries, their core activity is selling copies of papers and then or TV programs and boosting audiences, which is why they will generally go for the political lowest common denominator, because it can be seen to sell. And therefore, I think the Sunday Telegraph will say something different to the Daily Telegraph, because they're nervous about how their readers are going to respond if their company products are just coming down one side or the other. They have to keep their readers on board. It's why the Daily Mail, was very sympathetic to the Stephen Lawrence campaign, for example. They wanted, in that particular case, to sell more to them. So I think if we keep the economic alongside the political and ideological, it's quite helpful.
Yeah, my name's Tom Kay. I'm from the student office of the Socialist Workers Party, and I suppose the first thing I want to do is really make a confession, and that's to say that I've actually quite enjoyed watching the media over the past couple of months, probably for the first time in my life. Let's not forget that David Cameron had to admit what he got up to when he was younger in front of everyone, but nonetheless, watching the Tories in crisis over the past few days, I think has been illuminating for people, because throughout the referendum campaign, the Tories have been called, well, both wings of the Tory party have been calling each other liars on telly. Now, I've got to be honest with you, I already knew they were a liar. But they've admitted it now. That's a good thing. That's something that wouldn't happen on the same scale if it wasn't for media and so on. But you also see the way in which the media at specific times acts as a direct arm of the establishment, and you see that clearly now around the question of the coup against Corbyn, where it is clear, this isn't about being conspiratorial and so on, but it is clear that there is a relationship between the Labour right and the BBC, in particular around Laura Kuenssberg, where you can have members of the shadow cabinet resign on the hour, every hour, and then be in the BBC studio within 5 minutes, which is a very impressive thing to do in truth, unless it's being planned. Why do they do that? Because the truth is that the establishment media and the establishment politicians have the same interests. I want to make a third point really, and that is about the relationship between the media and between the movement, because people will remember the photo of Aylan al-Kurdi, the 3-year-old Syrian drowned on a beach in Bodrum. The vast majority of people, well in fact all people, ingested that image for the first time through a media source, whether it was on the front page of a newspaper or whether it was on Facebook and so on. And that actually acted as a massive spur for people. It brought hundreds of thousands of people onto the streets. People might remember on September the 12th, the day that Jeremy Corbyn was elected, the first thing that he did was speak at a demonstration that said refugees welcome here. In part, that demonstration was the size that it was because it reflected the anger that people felt about having seen that image, amongst other things, of course, thousands of people drowning and so on, but it can act as a stimulus for people in a movement. But also it's true that movements that want to fundamentally deal with the problems that are expressed in the media have to go past the establishment media, because it isn't true, by the way, that The Guardian is suddenly going to become revolutionary. They're not going to do that to try and sell things, sell newspapers and so on, because it's about representing an ideological viewpoint in society. That's what The Guardian does, and I suppose that's why it's important that newspapers like Socialist Worker exist, but also organisations like the Socialist Workers Party exist, because it's important that we have media and organisation which can interact with, reflect and make the arguments of the movement. The front page of Socialist Worker this week, and this is where I'll end, is "Defend Corbyn, if we fight, we can win." That's an important message, which what both has to be argued, but also in physical form can be used to put an argument to a much wider layer of people that we can kick this rotten government over.
Yeah, there's a broader question about how ideology works in society here, because the way ideology works relies on two things. The first thing it relies on is the ruling class having a common ideology to sell. And there are moments in which the ruling class doesn't have a common, coherent ideology. One moment is the Iraq War, where two national newspapers came out in opposition to the Iraq War, the Independent and the Mirror, precisely because the ruling class was divided. The EU referendum is another interesting example of this. But the other thing that ideology relies on is to gain any kind of purchase over ordinary people, to sell newspapers, but also to get people to listen to you. You have to have the aura of impartiality. And it's a little bit like how the law works. See, people only trust the law if sometimes it finds on behalf of working class people. If the law found every time, universally, on the side of the ruling class, no working class person would ever go to law, and people would seek mass struggle as an alternative. So ideology can only work if it actually creates this aura of impartiality. And that's why even within the right-wing mainstream bourgeois media, you get elements of lived struggle, lived experience, and even socialist ideas creeping through here and there. Always in a context in which the dominant idea is the ideas of the ruling class, but always you get these little glimpses of working class struggle. And that has some very interesting implications. See, one implication is that there are certain things that the mainstream media cannot sell to people. Take the idea that we're not working class anymore. There's a fascinating study, it appears in the Financial Times today, that shows that over 60% of people in Britain believe that they're working class. Almost exactly the same number as in 1983, despite decades of people being told they're not working class anymore. And most of those people believe the gap between rich and poor is growing in British society, despite decades of being told the gap is getting narrower. Certain things you can't sell. But I want to come to a final example, which is the argument over migrants. Because the argument over migrants has much, much wider purchase inside the working class. But the media never sell us this idea, or very rarely sell us this idea, by saying that migrants are evil. What they actually sell to us is the idea that there's competition for jobs, competition for housing, competition, and people's lives are getting worse and worse every year, and the migrants are to blame. They have to mix it up with a recognition that life is getting worse for millions upon millions of people. And that means when we want to confront the arguments over migrants, of course we have to have a battle within the media, of course we have to mobilise social media to do that and all the rest of it, but we also have to have a mass movement of people who say, actually it's true your life is getting worse. It's true there's competition over jobs and housing and so on. Who's to blame for that? Not the migrants, but the people in Westminster, the ruling class, the people who keep their houses empty so you don't have a house and all the rest of it. It's through building a mass movement from below that we can begin to shift the balance and begin to open a space in which left-wing ideas and anti-racist ideas come to the fore.
Is there anyone who wants to bring up any last points or final questions before I bring John back? Yeah?
Hi, my name is Naima. I'm from the Southwark SWP branch. The thing that frustrates me the most is the lack of representation of other countries around the world. Like, I'm Somali, and recently there was a terror attack there, and not a single newspaper or anything recognized it. And then when it was Turkey, something closer to home, people latched upon it. And I think that's what frustrates me the most, is that this idea of struggle and frustration, and this, like, the way that people are treated around the world, but it's not being represented or shown to others, and people don't have any ideas of it. The people, as I said, I'm Somali, the only thing people know about us is they will always refer to pirates or something negative. They won't refer to anything else, the troubles they've been through, the fact that the US have started bombing them again. Recently they bombed, I can't remember how much it was, but the newspaper said, oh, it's okay, mostly all of them were terrorists. You didn't know who it was. It could have just been like normal civilians getting bombed, but yet no one chose to like recognize that.
Okay, well, I'd like to thank everybody for the contributions, and actually, as is often the case at Marxism, often the people from the floor know rather more than the person who's delivered the talk, and I knew I would learn things from that, and I thank you very much. I particularly wanted to start, actually, perhaps by saying to the young woman at the back who spoke from the team, who I thought spoke brilliantly, really, about the way search engines work. I think you should write something for the Socialist Review about it. And it's one of the things, actually, that is a fantastic book, but it is a bit out of date about, really, how social media, operates. And I think it would be, genuinely, I think it would be a really interesting and useful contribution, particularly, I'm not going to make it, but younger people who are much more, some older people, much more au fait with these things. We ought to be looking a bit more. And interesting that, now, and I've got no idea how this is going to play out, but children in schools, learning computer programming is now part of the national syllabus. So, younger children now, how are the ruling class? That's an interesting question. I should have thrown it out earlier. How are the ruling class going to use that, and what does that really mean for the progress of social media? So thank you particularly for your contribution. I think people were right. Nick made the point very strongly that papers are for profit, and they wouldn't exist if they weren't making profit. And again, that they have to reflect the experience of people's lives. And it's interesting, just a little thing, that one of the most popular programmes on TV through, I can't remember when was it on, the 80s, was it? Yes Minister, a programme that lots of people said was a very accurate reflection of what really the civil service, the life of being a civil service, being a civil servant. And it's interesting, they had to change that, didn't they, and update it when they brought in the thick of it. And again, a very subversive programme. And if people want to look at subversive programmes, I can never find it actually on iPlayer, but W1A, which is a programme about the BBC, is absolutely hilarious. And a friend, she's coming later to Marxism, who works for the BBC, says it's incredibly accurate, cynical, brutal view of what news production is like, particularly in the BBC. So people are right, they've got to give us things that do have some connection. It can't all just be fantasy. But I just wanted to end on this. I am absolutely, I hope I didn't give the impression that I think that social media doesn't have a role to play in the revolution. I think the French comrade made a very important point about the way that we can use even our own cameras on occasions to expose things like the brutality of the police. I was discussing a younger comrade was talking to me last night about how, the social media at the moment is absolutely full of people who use their iPhones on buses and public transport in particularly, where they witness horrible, brutal, normally verbal but still sometimes physical, racist assaults, and how we ought to all be we ought to be all thinking everywhere where people see those kind of things that they're able to video themselves challenging it. Let's have more of that on social media. So I do think it can be, and it can be a very, very important tool. I've used it myself to try and get people I know to come to events like this or other things. Indeed, I can remember writing something for our pre-conference discussion a couple of years ago with a younger comrade about how we needed to use the internet and social media a lot more, and I am delighted that Socialist Worker, and if anyone hasn't seen it, doesn't go on, have a look. We're able to be much more of the moment and make social comment much more quickly and organise through developing that area of our work. So I think that it's important, and we need to, all of us, and maybe some experts, we need a few more experts developing theories and ideas about how we could use it more effectively.